The hem of Princess Alara's bridal gown, a river of silk woven with real moon pearls from her homeland, made a sound like grinding teeth as it dragged across the council chamber floor. Twas the morning of October 23rd, a date now etched in her memory, not as a celebration, but as a transaction. The air in the great throne room of the Central Kingdom's palace was thick, heavy with the scent of lilies from the southern valleys and the beeswax of 1,000 candles. She stood beside Prince Consort Kaelin, her new husband, feeling the weight of the silver-threaded veil like a soft cage around her face. Around them, the court was a living painting of silk and jewels. 217 guests, by the official tally, filled the hall with a low, polite hum. Alara's eyes, a quiet shade of hazel that looked almost green in the forest light of her home, now scanned the crowd without moving her head. She saw Lord Braden with his impressive white mustache, nodding approvingly. She saw Lady Selene wearing a diamond necklace so large it looked like it might topple her forward. And she saw her own people, the delegation from the Eastern Reaches, standing stiff and silent in their new, unfamiliar court clothes. Her father, King Arlan, was not among them. He had said his goodbyes at the border, his hand on her cheek, his eyes saying everything his words could not. Just a little longer. My rooted flower, Kaelin murmured beside her. This voice, a pleasant baritone meant only for her ears. Too. He didn't look at her. He smiled at the Archbishop, at his parents, at the crowd. Hughes, every bit the Golden Prince, 28 years old with hair the color of wheat and a smile that never seemed to falter. Too. He squeezed her hand where it rested on his arm. His grip was perfect, not too loose, not too tight. It felt like being held by a beautifully carved wooden hand. The portraits came next. They were led to two her-backed chairs of dark mahogany, set before a tapestry depicting the Central Kingdom's victory at the Battle of the Grey Plains 80 years prior. Alara sat back straight, her gown pooling around her like spilled milk. The court painter, a small man named Felder with paint under his fingernails, positioned them, chin up. Your Highness, a little more light on the face, he directed. Kaelin's posture was naturally regal, one hand on the carved lion head of the chair. Lara tried to mirror him, but her shoulders ached from the hours of ceremony. As Felder sketched, her mind drifted away from the smell of linseed oil and the scratch of charcoal on canvas, drifted back to her antechamber that morning, to the one thing that had felt like hers. On the wall had hung an old tapestry, a bit frayed at the edges. It showed the emerald forest of the Eastern Reaches, a tangle of ancient oaks, silvery birches, and a hidden stitching thread waterfall where she used to play as a child. The wool was faded in places, and if you pressed your nose to it, you could just catch the faint ghostly smell of wood smoke and damp earth. It was the first thing she'd had her maids unpack, was a piece of home. The portrait session felt like it lasted a century. Finally, they were released for the state dinner. The great hall was transformed for long tables, each seating 50, groaned under platters of roasted swan garnished with gold leaf, towers of fruit, and steaming loaves of bread. The sound was different, here clattering plates, laughter, the constant slosh of wine into goblets. Alara was seated at the high table on a dais, Kaelin to her right, his father King Gregor to his right. She picked at a piece of soft cheese, the taste bland on her tongue. You must try the spiced wine. My dear, King Gregor boomed, his voice cutting through the din. A recipe from our western provinces, quite robust. Alara nodded and took a small sip. It was too sweet, with a clove scent that burned her nose. She set the goblet down. Kaelin leaned over to the court. It must have looked like a loving whisper. He reached for the delicate chain of moonstones around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin. They were cold. A beautiful piece, he said loudly, for show. Then his voice dropped, his breath warm and smelling strongly of the spiced wine. His fingers, still on the necklace, pressed just slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to feel like a warning. But you wore it on the left side. Protocol dictates the right for state dinners. A small thing, but important. We must be perfect, mustn't we? He leaned back, his smile never wavering, and took a hearty drink from his own cup. Alara's cheekbones ached from holding her own smile in place. She felt a hot flush crawl up her neck. It wasn't a mistake. She had worn it on the left, deliberately, a tiny silent nod to her mother, who had always said the left side was closer to the heart. Kaelin had known it had been a test, and she had failed by having a heart at all. In that moment, she saw the prince behind the smile. His eyes, a clear, cool blue, held not anger, but a kind of satisfied calculation. The alliance was secure. The treaty was signed. Spic prisoner, she realized, was now fully in her cell. The feast dragged on through 7 courses. Alara watched the sun set through the high, narrow windows. DeLong, colored lights stretched across the floor, painting warped, sad versions of the conquered eastern banners that hung between the Central Kingdom's own proud flags. She watched the shadows grow and merge, swallowing the room bite by bite, when she was finally allowed to retire. The silence of the West Wing hallway was a shock to her ears. Her personal maid, Lina, a girl from the Reaches with kind eyes, helped her out of the monstrous gown. Was it lovely? My lady, Lina asked softly, her fingers careful on the pearl buttons. It was very grand, Alara answered, her voice hoarse from disuse. Lina just nodded, understanding. Once alone wearing a simple linen nightdress, Alara finally let her shoulders slump. Shu walked across the cool marble floor to the window, looking out at the foreign city below, its lights twinkling like a field of captured stars. She needed a piece of home. Right now, she turned, intending to go and trace the familiar stitches of her forest tapestry, to breathe in its old scent, but it was gone. In its place, on the same iron wall hook, was a new painting. It was large and imposing, done in oils. It showed the Starkwind Mountains of the Central Kingdom, good grey peaks piercing a harsh sky, with a single lonely eagle circling. It was technically masterful, and utterly cold. Ilara's breath caught. She crossed the room, her bare feet silent. Shu reached out and touched the canvas. It's dry, but when she leaned closer, the smell hit her. Was the sharp pine sap tang of fresh varnish and new paint, aggressive and clean. Tio wiped out everything. That comforting, faint smell of wool and hearth smoke from her tapestry was gone. Completely erased, as if it had never been there at all. This wasn't just a decoration change. It was an eradication. Shu stood there in the quiet, well-appointed room, the mountain scene looming over her, and felt a hollow open up inside her chest. The message was clearer than any spoken decree. Asterisk, your past is painted over. Your roots are cut. Asterisk, but as she stood there, the initial shock fading into a cold, clear feeling in her veins, a thought occurred to her. Can paint over a wall. What if something is growing in the cracks behind it? She didn't know what that something could be yet. She only knew that the quiet girl from the forests was still in there, and she was just beginning to wake up. Sometimes, the biggest changes in our lives start with the smallest moments of realizing what we've lost, deciding, deep down, that we're going to find a way to grow something new, no matter what soil we're given. For the first week after the wedding, Princess Alara felt like a ghost in her own body. She moved through the polished routines of the royal court, but her hands had developed a slight, constant tremor. Shu pressed her tongue firmly to the roof of her mouth, a trick she'd learned as a child to stop herself from crying. Only now she used it to stop herself from speaking. The wrong word, she knew, could be more dangerous than any sword. Her days were a blur of stifling appointments. Mondays were for receiving petitioners in the sunroom. Tuesdays, embroidery with the royal lady stitching endless perfect lilies onto handkerchiefs she would never use. Wednesdays, music lessons where she learned the complex, sharp melodies of central folk songs that felt strange on her fingers. 2. The air in these rooms was always too warm, smelling of rosewater and the faint, metallic scent of the large brass heaters in the corners. She saw Prince Kaelin at dinners and public walks. He was always charming, always correct. He would offer her his arm, ask about her day in a voice loud enough for others to hear, and his smile never reached those cool blue eyes. It was a performance, and she was his most important prop. Her only sanctuary was her private antechamber, the one with the offending mountain painting. Bet even that had been violated. She began to notice other small changes. The small jade horse from her childhood dressing table was gone, replaced by a crystal figurine of a Central Kingdom stag. favorite book of Eastern poetry had vanished from the bedside table. It was a slow, quiet, disappearing act. They weren't taking her jewels or her clothes. They were taking her memories, one polished object at a time. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the wedding, during a particularly dull lecture on the history of the palace tapestries, she found her mind escaping. It drifted to a small, hidden treasure. Before leaving home, her younger brother Finn had slipped her a parting gift. It was a simple wooden music box, carved with the shape of a leaping hare. Side. When you opened it, a tiny, tinny version of an Eastern lullaby played there, and tucked beneath the mechanism, wrapped in a scrap of green cloth, was a single perfect acorn from the great oak tree outside her old bedroom window. "So, you can grow a piece of home," he'd whispered. That acorn was still hidden in the music box, which she'd buried under a pile of winter shawls in her largest trunk. A wild, rebellious thought sprouted in her mind. They could take her tapestry and her jade horse, but they couldn't control what grew that evening. Under the guise of needing some air, she asked Lina to bring a potted fern to her room. It was a common variety, with long, graceful fronds, often used to decorate the palace hallways. "The green of the forest," Ilara said simply, and Lina, with a knowing look, brought her a large clay pot with a particularly lush plant. When she was alone, with only the flickering light of the fireplace, Ilara acted, her heart hammered against her ribs as she retrieved the music box. The lullaby played its few sad notes as she opened it. There, nestled in the green cloth, was the acorn, smooth and hard and the color of rich earth. She didn't plant it in a new pot. That would be too obvious. Instead, she gently pushed aside the soil at the base of the broad fern. Deep down near the roots where the dirt was cool and damp, she placed the acorn there, covered it over, and patted the moss back into place. It was a tiny act. Two was everything. This small rebellion changed her. The energy she had been using to hold herself perfectly still, to be a placid, smiling statue, began to redirect itself. She stopped eating the honey-sweet pastries that were always sent to her room by the prince's head steward, a man named Gorvin with a perfectly trimmed beard. She claimed a sudden sensitivity to almonds. In truth, she just wanted a clear head. She needed to see. So, she began to watch. Truly, watch. She noticed that when Kaelin made a joke about the Eastern Reach's quaint farming techniques, Lord Braden's famous laugh was a beat too late. She saw Lady Celine's knuckles turn white around her wine goblet whenever the prince discussed new taxes on the southern silver mines, which her family controlled. During a long council meeting about trade routes, she counted how many of the 12 council members' eyes drifted to the floor when Kaelin spoke, rather than meeting his gaze. 3 of them, 3 sets of downcast eyes. GOSE. She also watched the moon. In the Eastern Reaches, her people tracked time by its cycles, planning plantings and harvests by its silver light. On the night of the first full moon since her arrival, the frost moon of November, she stood at her window and watched it rise over the stark mountain painting silhouette. It was a different moon here, colder somehow. She marked it on a tiny, hidden calendar she'd drawn on the back of a sheet of music. As the days grew shorter and sharper, she checked on her fern, now her secret garden. Every morning, she gave it water from her own drinking glass. 4 weeks. Nothing happened. The fern remained green, the soil undisturbed. Doubt crept in. Maybe the acorn was dead. Maybe nothing could grow in this foreign place. Then, on a grey morning in early December, she saw it. A tiny, pale green tendril, no thicker than a thread, had pushed its way up through the dark soil. Curling like a question mark against the fern's sturdy stem, was so fragile, so brave. A lump formed in Elara's throat, was growing. Finding the sprout gave her a new kind of courage. She needed to protect it, to help it reach for the thin winter light from the window. She needed a small stick, something to gently support it. Looking around her room, she saw nothing suitable. Then, her eyes fell on the large fireplace. The hearth was made of a beautiful veined grey marble, and one of the stones at the very edge, close to the wall, looked a little loose. It was worth a try. She knelt on the rug, the wool ruff against her knees. She wedged her fingernails into the thin crack around the stone, wiggled. With a little more pressure, she pried it up. Slot underneath wasn't mortar, but a hollow space, black with soot and old ash. Reaching in, her fingers brushed against something that wasn't stone, was paper. Brittle and dry. She pulled it out, was a single sheet, folded small, poor. The writing was in a tight, elegant script, faded in places. The date at the top made her breath catch. Asterisk, 15th of April. Last year it was a letter, my dearest Sarah. Asterisk it began, a name she didn't know. Asterisk, the nights are the longest in the West Wing. He thinks my silence is acceptance, but it is only storage. I store every slight, every veiled threat, every smile that is a blade. Keys. Not a man, my friend, but a system, a clockwork of power and control. To fight the man is to lose. But a clockwork has tiny, essential parts. Find one stone, loosen it with patience, and the whole wall may yet follow. Pi. Fear my time for loosening stones is short. 2. The loneliness here is a cold tea, drank daily. Remember me. Asterisk, it was unsigned. Better Lara knew. Sierra must have been a friend, a confidant, and the writer. Through. The previous occupant of these rooms had been Kellen's first wife, Lady Lyra, from the northern provinces. The official story was that she had died suddenly, a year ago, of a deep melancholy that weakened her heart. The court called it a tragedy. Death. Brittle note, hidden in a hole by the fire, told a different story. It spoke of a prison, of a system, and of a quiet, desperate resistance. Alara sat back on her heels, the soot-smudged letter in her hand, the cold from the marbles seeping through her dress. Throw. The brave little sprout stood in its pot across the room. The words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, he is not a man, but a system. Topple. A stone, and the wall may follow. Asterisk, for the first time since arriving, Alara didn't feel entirely alone. Someone else had sat in this room, had felt this cold, had looked at these same grey mountains in a painting. That someone had not just given up. They had left a message, a map of sorts, hidden in the darkness. It was a terrible, heartbreaking discovery, but it was also a spark. It meant that the silence in this palace wasn't just obedience. Some of it was storage, some of it was waiting. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the only one planting secret seeds in the dark, hoping for something to grow. The discovery of the letter felt like lighting a candle in a vast, dark cellar. For a few days, Alara carried its words inside her like a warm secret. Store. Asterisk, he is not a man, but a system. It gave a name to the strange, faceless pressure she felt. It gave her a purpose. To look for loose stones. She began looking for the writer's friend, Bert, the mysterious Sarah. She listened for the name and conversation, studied the court rolls in the library, and watched the faces of the older ladies. Her search led her to a kind-faced woman in her 60s, Serafina, who worked in the palace archives mending old books. One afternoon, Alara brought a small volume of Eastern poetry with a torn binding to the archives, a place that smelled of dust, old paper, and glue. I was told you are the best restorer, Alara said, her voice gentle. Serafina looked up, her eyes magnified by small, round spectacles. They flickered over Ilara's face, then down to the book in her hands. In stitch binding, she noted softly, a delicate craft. As she took the book, her fingers brushed Ilara's, and for a second, their eyes held. There was a recognition there, a silent flash of understanding. No names were spoken, but Alara felt sure. B.S. This was Seradot. It was the start of something fragile. Through careful, coded conversations about book repairs and palace history, a quiet alliance formed. Serafina, in turn, seemed to be watching out for her. Shu once subtly redirected Alara from a dish of soup at a large dinner. A barely perceptible shake of her head slipped a note. She slipped a note into the repaired poetry book that simply read, Asterisk, trust the quiet ones. Asterisk. Alara started to notice the quiet ones. There was the young guard, Garrett, who always stood post at the western garden door and had a brother who had been sent to a remote border fort after a dispute with one of Kellen's favorites. There, with the master of the household accounts, a severe woman named Hester, whose ledgers were a work of art, but whose mouth was a tight, thin line whenever the prince's expenses were discussed, using Serafina as a careful go-between. Alara began to connect these loose stones, a word of thanks to Garrett for his diligence, which led to a snippet of information about the guard rotation schedules, a comment to Hester about appreciating efficiency, which opened a door to discussions about the kingdom's real finances, not the glittering picture presented at court. 'Twas slow, delicate work, like building a house of cards in a gentle breeze. Then, winter tightened its grip. The Deep Frost celebrations in mid-January were a spectacle of forced cheer. The Great Hall was draped in endless swaths of blue and silver silk, and imported frostpine trees were hung with glass icicles that tinkled with every draught. The height of the feast, Prince Kaelan made an announcement, whose voice, amplified by the hall's acoustics, rang out clear and proud. "In the spirit of unity this deep frost brings," he proclaimed, raising his crystal goblet, "we are pleased to announce that the artisans of the Eastern Reaches will join our own royal guilds. Their distinct styles will be integrated, creating a new, stronger tradition for all." A polite, thunderous applause filled the room. Lara's smile felt frozen on her face. This wasn't unity. It was assimilation. Tweets. It was the erasure of her people's art, their history, their identity, repackaged as a gift. She scanned the room for her Eastern delegation. They were clapping too, their movements stiff and mechanical. Slat. And then she saw old Lord Jaren, her father's most trusted advisor. Whose eyes met hers across the crowded hall. In them, she saw no anger, only a deep, weary shame. And in that shame, she saw a reflection of her own. She was the symbol of this. Her compliant marriage, her quiet presence at this table, was the permission slip for it all. Her silence wasn't keeping the peace. It was signing the death warrant for everything she loved. Vorm. Candle of hope the letter had given her guttered and went out, replaced by a cold, hollow wind. The very next day, everything changed. Serafina was gone. Vince. When Alara went to the archives, a new young clerk was at the desk. "Oh, Mistress Seraphina," the girl said brightly. She retired suddenly. Les left for her sister's farm in the country. Very quick affair. Illyra's blood ran cold. Retired suddenly. The words were a well-rehearsed lie, as smooth and polished as the palace floors. Her one connection, her guide, had been swept away. The system had noticed her tiny movements, and it had removed a stone. Isolation closed around her like a fog. Kaelan, citing concerns for her adjustment and the harsh winter winds, suggested she restrict her activities to the royal wing. It was presented as kindness. "You look pale, my dear," he said, his hand on her shoulder. "The court can be so draining. Rest, take your ease." It was a gentle, gilded cage. Her walks were limited to the enclosed glass solarium. Her visitors were screened. The world shrank to the pattern of the carpets. The view of the courtyard from her window, and the ever-present watchful eyes of Gorvin, the steward, the darkest point, came on a night in early February. A small, formal dinner was held in the royal wing itself. Her Eastern delegation was invited, a show of continued closeness. They arrived, dressed in Central-style clothing that hung awkwardly on them. They spoke in polite, clipped sentences. They called her Your Highness, not Princess Alara. They would not meet her eyes. They were like careful ghosts of the people she knew. Shu's no longer there. Princess Shu, with the prince's consort. Part of the machinery that was dismantling their world. After they left, Alara stood before the tall, dark window in her room. Her reflection was a pale smudge against the black night, a young woman in a beautiful blue gown. Alone in a brightly lit room, she wasn't a rebel. She wasn't a savior. She was a decoration, a pretty, silent lock on the chains that bound her people. A soft knock came at her door late that night. It was Lena, her maid, her face drawn. Without a word, she slipped a small, folded piece of paper into Alara's hand, and then disappeared back into the hallway. Through paper was thick, expensive, too. The handwriting was not Seraphine's. It was an invitation and an offer. It spoke of a group, a coalition of those who saw the truth of the system. lesser nobles whose lands had been seized under thin pretenses, guildmasters whose trades were being choked by new laws, even some within the palace guard, loyal to the crown's true legacy, not to the prince's ambition. They had a plan. It's said, too, at the spring festival, when the palace was busy and distracted, they would act, but they needed a figurehead, a royal face to give their rebellion legitimacy. They offered her the crown of a truly united kingdom in return. All she had to do was say yes and be their public symbol. The rest was spelled out in the silence between the lines. Capture, disgrace, almost certain death if they failed. Here was the impossible choice, laid bare on creamy paper. To refuse was to remain in this gilded cage, to watch her world be painted over piece by piece, to be a prisoner with a title. To accept was to step into a storm, to risk not just her life but to spark a conflict that could drown the entire kingdom in blood. Was the choice between a slow, quiet erasure and a violent, dangerous explosion. For 3 days, Elara barely slept or ate. She carried the note with her everywhere, a hidden weight. She stared at the mountain painting, at her brave little oak sprout, now hidden in a wardrobe, its leaves pale from lack of true sunlight. She thought of her father's last look, of Lord Jaren's shame, of Seraphine's sudden retirement. On the 3rd night, she made her decision. She took out the brittle, soot-stained letter from the fireplace, the one that had started it all. She would need its wisdom. She would say yes, she would be there, signal fire. She sat at her desk, the hidden oak sprout in its pot beside her, a tiny symbol of growth in the dark. She reached for a pen to send her reply, and as she did, her sleeve brushed against another piece of paper on her desk, a receipt for book repairs, signed by Serafina, a sample of her real flowing handwriting. Elara's eyes darted from the receipt to the brittle hidden letter, to handwriting. She'd been so comforted by the words, she'd never truly compared them. Now, with a cold, sinking clarity, she did. The tight, elegant script of the hidden letter, towels, and the soft, flowing curls of Seraphine's true hand. They were similar. At a glance, but they were not the same. The loop on the Y was different. The cross on the T was sharper. They were the work of 2 different people. The room seemed to tilt. There grew thick. The letter that had been her compass, her spark of hope, was a beautiful, careful fake. The loose stone had been placed there for her to find. The rebellion she was about to join wasn't a secret she had uncovered. It was a trap, laid specifically for her. She sat there, the unsent reply before her, the 2 pieces of paper side by side like evidence in a terrible trial. The cold wasn't just in the stone walls anymore, it was deep in her bones. And then Princess Elara realized the letter from the first wife was a lie. She was utterly alone. And the walls weren't just watching, they were listening, and they had been guiding her steps all along. In that moment of terrifying clarity, she also understood something else. The strongest trees don't grow by rushing toward the first patch of light they see. Sometimes, they have to grow slowly, carefully, feeling their way through the dark, solid ground. Because the easiest path is often the one that leads you right into the waiting sore. The truth was a cold shock, like plunging her face into a basin of winter stream water. For a long moment, Elara just sat at her desk, the 2 pieces of paper staring up at her, the forged letter with its pretty lies, and Seraphine's genuine, looping script. The trap was so elegant, so cruel. They wanted her to run, to rebel, to give them a public reason to crush her and anyone associated with her. They wanted the unstable Eastern princess story to be the final chapter. The fear was a live thing in her chest, fluttering like a trapped bird. But, as she sat there, the initial ice in her veins began to burn. They thought they knew her, though. They thought she was a scared girl who would either break or run. They saw her quietness as weakness, her love for her home as a sentimental flaw. Fine, she would give them exactly what they expected. She would become the perfect, predictable Mark. The first step was to play the part of the clumsy rebel. She'd left the forged letter exactly where she'd found it, a stone in a hole by the fire. She wrote a reply to the fake rebellion's invitation. Was full of careful, nervous language. I am afraid, but my heart is with my people. Thai. I will be your symbol. Asterisk. This sort of thing a desperate romantic young woman would write. She sent it via the channel they'd provided. A loose stone in the kitchen wall behind a flower bin. Then, she changed her entire demeanor in public. She began to speak up in the weekly council meetings, which she was still allowed to attend as a formality. But she didn't speak of justice or rebellion. She spoke of the most boring topics imaginable. The root structures of the mountain firs are fascinating, aren't they? She'd say during a debate on border security. Such a deep, interlocking network. It reminds one that stability comes from below the surface. The council members would blink, offer polite nods, and quickly return to their important discussions. Prince Kalen would watch her with a slightly amused, slightly bored expression. His rooted flower was showing her simple, earthy colors. She asked the head gardener for books on crop rotation. Shu openly lamented the poor quality of the potting soil in the palace ferns. She became a harmless enthusiast of dirt and sprouts. 2. Her greatest performance was with her hidden oak sapling. She moved it from the wardrobe to a prominent spot on her windowsill. She would fuss over it in front of her maids, talking to it, worrying over its pale leaves. I just can't seem to get the light right for you here, little one. She'd sigh loudly, her voice carrying into the hallway. It was all so pathetic, so obvious. Gorvin, the steward, reported her odd behavior, and she knew he did. Sheet could see the satisfaction in Kellen's eyes. His pawn was exactly where he wanted her, visible, silly, and digging in the wrong garden. But while her public self was a performance of nostalgic simplicity, her private self was working in the real, silent earth. The forged letter had said one true thing, even if it was a lie. Asterisk, he is not a man, but a system. And a system was made of people, of pressures, of connections, and leaks. She stopped looking for rebels and started looking for pressure points. She remembered Lady Celine's white knuckles around her wine glass. Through careful, idle chatter with a maid who served the southern sweets, Elara learned Lady Celine's family silver mines were being audited by the Crown, and the inspectors were not being kind. She remembered the 3 council members with downcast eyes, a gift of rare Eastern tea, sent with a note thanking one for his kind advice on adapting to new soil, opened a door. These reply was formal, but it contained a fragment. Asterisk, the soil here is often rocky. Highness, it requires patience. It was an acknowledgement, a tiny connection. Her most important work was with the quiet ones she'd already identified. She could no longer risk speaking to them directly. So, she used the palace itself. She left a book on advanced clockwork mechanics, a topic she had no reason to study. On a bench in the library where Garrett the guard took his breaks, who was the son of a clockmaker, took the book. Later, she accidentally dropped a detailed map of the palace's older, disused servant corridors, the ones not on official guard schedules, near where he stood post. 2. It was not a request, but a piece of a puzzle, left for him to find if he chose to. For Hester, the severe account mistress, she had a different approach. During a walk in the solarium, Elara admired the intricate, mathematically perfect patterns of the frost on the glass. It reminds me of a well-kept ledger, she mused to Lina, loudly enough for a passing Hester to hear. Everything in its place, a pattern of beautiful, cold order. The next day, a single anonymous sheet of accounting figures appeared in her room, mixed in with her music sheets. It showed a discrepancy, a large sum of gold from the Eastern Tribute. Payments that was logged as security costs, but had no corresponding guard payroll. It was a loose stone in the financial wall. Elara didn't act on it, she just stored it. The days marched on, toward the Spring Thaw Festival. Set for the 1st of March. The palace buzzed with preparation. Banners were hung, tables polished, and the scent of baking sweetbreads filled the lower halls. Elara could feel the trap tightening. Day. The fake rebels would make their move at the height of the festivities. Kellen's guards would be ready. Ooh, and she would be caught in the middle, the perfect, guilty figurehead. The morning of the festival dawned clear and cold. Spow. The official ceremony was held in the main courtyard at noon. All the court was there, a sea of green and gold velvet. Shit. Prince Kaelin stood at the center, respectfully. His big announcement was not a surprise to Alara bit. It was a dagger to her heart. Today, as the ice recedes and new life begins, he proclaimed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. We also forge a new, stronger unity. He gestured, and a servant brought forward a velvet cushion, stone it. On it lay the ancient coronet of the eastern reaches, a simple, beautiful band of silver woven to look like oak leaves, centuries old. This symbol of a separate past, Kaelin said, his hand hovering over it, shall be melted down. Silver will be used to cast the first spell for the new Grand Unity Chapel. From separation, we create a single, harmonious voice. A gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by hurried, obedient applause. Alara saw her country's delegation. Lord Jaren looked like he'd been struck. This was the final erasure, not just a painting or a tapestry, but their history, liquefied in a furnace. This was her cue. The trap expected the unstable princess to crack. So she did. Sheet let out a small, choked sound. She pressed a hand to her mouth. Her eyes went wide with what looked like horror. She turned and fled the courtyard, pushing through the startled crowd, the silk of her festival gown whispering loudly as she ran. She didn't look back, but she could feel the eyes on her. Sheet could picture Kellen's slight, satisfied smile. The rabbit was running right down the snare line. She didn't run to the fake meeting point in the old stables. Instead, she ran to the one place she'd made a show of caring about, the secluded palace conservatory. A glass-walled room filled with tropical plants that smelled of damp soil and hot green life was where she'd often been seen tending her sad little oak sapling. 'Twas a perfectly pathetic place for a desperate girl to hide. She burst through the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She went straight to a bench in the far corner, near a towering broad-leafed philodendron. She knelt, pretending to search for something in the soil, her shoulders shaking as if she were weeping. She didn't have to wait long. Door crashed open, not with the quiet stealth of rebels, but with the heavy, booted authority of the prince's personal guard. 6 of them, led by Gorvin himself, filled the doorway. Outside the glass walls, she could see other guards surrounding the building. The trap was sprung. Gorvin stepped forward, his face a mask of polite concern. Your Highness, he said, his voice oily. You are distressed. You are not where you are supposed to be. We have concerns for your safety. There are dangerous elements in the palace today. Alara stood up slowly, brushing soil from her skirts. She turned to face him, letting her eyes look wide and scared. She was the picture of a caught, foolish child. A system had won. She looked past Gorvin out the conservatory door, down the long, polished hallway that led to the heart of the palace. And then she said it, her voice clear and quiet, carrying in the humid air. Now, it wasn't a plea. 'Twasn't a sob, too. It was a single, simple word, spoken not to the guards, but to the stone wall at the end of the hall, a wall that held a forgotten air vent connected to the old servant passages. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Gorvin's smile began to return. Then, the sound came. Not the clash of swords he was expecting from the fake rebel ambush. It was a deeper, more fundamental sound. Was the heavy, resonant thud of a great door being barred, then another, a series of solid, echoing thumps that rolled through the palace stone like distant thunder. The sound of locks turning, of braces falling into place, of passages being sealed. It was the sound of the palace itself changing shape. The guards looked at each other, confused. A shout came from outside, muffled by the glass. Gorvin's smile vanished. The dangerous elements weren't in the conservatory with a crying princess. They were in the throne room with the prince. They weren't rebels with swords. They were quiet ones with keys, like the master of the keys, whose son had been passed over for promotion. They were clerks with ledgers, like Hester, proving financial corruption. They were guards who knew forgotten routes, like Garrett, sealing doors from the inside. Alara stood still, the green leaves of the conservatory plants framing her. She had never been the rebel leader in the shadows. She'd been the distraction in the light. While everyone watched the rooted flower tremble. The real work had been done by the roots themselves, spreading silently underground, finding the cracks, and finally, when the moment was right, pushing up with quiet, unstoppable force. The final move wasn't an attack, it was a transformation, and it had already begun. The grit on the council chamber floor was the same. A year later, as Ilare's Gaunadeep, forest green this time swept over the grey stone, she noticed it, tiny particles of sand and dust, forever being tracked in from the world outside. No matter how many times the floors were polished, it was a familiar, grounding feeling under her slippers. The room looked different now. The towering tapestry of the Battle of the Grey Plains had been taken down. Its place hung to new pieces. The restored forest tapestry from her old room, its colors, vibrant again after careful work by the archivists. Beside it, a simple, beautiful weaving of the Starkwind Mountains, made by the Central Kingdom's own artisans. A dialogue, not a conquest. The air smelled of beeswax and the faint, clean scent of the rain that had just ended outside. Elara was not queen, she was regent steward, a title created for her. The true heir to the Eastern Reaches was her 4-year-old nephew, Theo, a cheerful boy who was currently, she knew, probably getting cookie crumbs on his lessons in the nursery. Her role was to guide the kingdom alongside a new council until he came of age. The portrait being painted today reflected that. She wasn't in the center. She'd stood slightly to the side, her hand resting lightly on the rim of a large circular tub made of clear glass that now sat in the very center of the room. So, inside the tub, growing in rich, dark soil, was the oak tree. It was not yet tall, maybe 3 feet high, but its trunk was sturdy, its leaves a healthy, vibrant green. The most remarkable thing was its roots. Because the tub was glass, you could see them. A complex, tangled, beautiful network of pale tendrils, spreading the earth, spreading out and digging deep, seeking nourishment and holding everything together. Lord Gerrit, looking more relaxed in his traditional Eastern tunic, was speaking to the council about the spring crop reports. Lady Selene, her family's mines now under a fairer contract, nodded along, adding notes about silver production. Garrett, no longer just a guard but the new captain of the West Wing, stood respectfully by the door, a faint smile on his face as he listened. The man with the yellow shoes, a former courtier named Silas, hurried in with a stack of papers for Hester, the head of the treasury. He was learning the value of work, it seemed. Elara listened, her fingers brushing a simple band of ironwood around her wrist. It was a gift from the foresters of her homeland, carved from a fallen branch of the very tree her acorn had come from. It was cool and smooth to the touch. The meeting ended with a plan to fund new irrigation channels in the southern farmlands. The council members filed out, chatting amongst themselves. The court painter, Felder, began to carefully pack his brushes. A good session. Steward, he said, the light was just right on the oak. Elara thanked him and walked to the large leaded glass window. Below, in the main courtyard, she could see the ongoing changes. Scaffolding was finally down from the old council tower. Its stones reaped. The chipped blue door to the former royal apartment Skellen's old rooms stood wide open, airing out. A maid was beating a rug on a balcony, sending puffs of dust into the sunlight. Prince Kaelin was not in the palace. After the events of the spring thaw, a quiet, firm agreement had been reached. She had taken up residence in a family estate in the northern lakes. Far from the levers of power, the system had been recalibrated, not shattered. The roots are secure, Steward, a voice said softly beside her. It was Hester, her ledger tucked under her arm. She wasn't talking about finances. Elara looked at the severe woman, now an indispensable ally, and saw the warmth in her eyes. The need to be watered. Still, Elara replied with a small smile. Every day. Hester gave a firm nod, a gesture of agreement, and left. Alone at the window, Elara let the quiet settle around her. The panic, the fear, the feeling of being a ghost in her own life, it was all a memory now. It had been replaced by a different kind of weight. The weight of responsibility, of early mornings reading reports, of difficult compromises, of soothing bruised egos and mending old rivalries. It was a heavy weight, but it was one she had chosen, and one she carried with her own 2 hands. She looked down at her wrist, At the ironwood band, she thought of the acorn, that tiny hidden seed of hope she'd planted in fear and loneliness. It hadn't grown because she was a perfect princess or a fierce warrior. It had grown because she'd been patient, because she'd learned to tell the difference between real nourishment and pretty poison, because she'd understood that the strongest growth often happens unseen, in the dark, quiet places, where you simply keep putting one resilient root after another into the ground, trusting that someday they'll find what they need to reach the light. The palace. Her life was full of scars. The replaced paintings, the sealed passages, the new laws written over old, unjust ones. They were all there. But a scar is not just a mark of a wound. It's also proof of healing. It's a place where the skin grew back, different, stronger. She turned from the window, her green gown whispering against the stone. She'd had one more meeting before lunch with the head gardener to discuss moving the young oak to a permanent spot in the courtyard when it was stronger. As she walked out of the council chamber, her hand brushed the glass of the tub one more time, a silent greeting to the tangled, busy roots within. Outside, the sun was fully out, sparkling on the rain-drenched courtyard. The world was not perfect. Pre-holiday. It was complex and messy, and required constant care. But, for the first time in a very long time, it was a world where something real, something she had nurtured from a tiny seed, could grow in the open air, reaching for the sun with every single steady leaf. And sometimes, that's the most powerful victory of all, not a dramatic explosion, but the quiet daily miracle of growth, and the courage it takes to keep planting seeds. Even when you're not sure where the light will come from.